Been working on this class for 10 days. I try sometimes to go out to the big picture in anthropology. And no one in my life has provided more of the big picture thinking in anthropology and maybe about the world than Michel Rolf Trouillot, affectionately known as Rolf, one of the first professors I met in graduate school at Johns Hopkins, a Haitian anthropologist, historian, really a brilliant person. He wrote two essays, one of which is very well known in anthropology, called Anthropology and the Savage Slot, except a bit of a Haitian accent. And so the way he pronounced slot made us wonder what exactly he was saying. But you can imagine different vowels in slot, you get what I'm talking about. Yes, and then that was 1991, a much reprinted and very famous essay about the scope of anthropology and what it fit into as a discipline. And then another essay which was published in the last book that he wrote, called Adieu. He was a French speaker. Adieu, culture, a new duty arises. Goodbye, culture, goodbye to culture, which is like a funny thing to say for an anthropologist. Goodbye, culture, a new duty arises. So I've been thinking about him because I've been thinking about what most of us believe is maybe the central question of anthropology. Why are people different from each other? Why do we perceive things differently, act differently, think differently, talk differently, walk differently? And perhaps as of at least 150 years ago, the answer to this for most people was something to do with biology or race or your physical or what was in your environment. So if you happen to be in a very cold place and that determined the way you were, or some combination of those. And the idea was that only in the West, in the Europe and the European influenced societies, and at the top of those societies, not even throughout them, the bottoms of those societies were seen as deprived of these things as well, that's where you had culture and language and art, architecture. And that if you went away from that area, or even into the lower classes, that you would find people who were unkempt, uncouth, and primitive. Or as Ingold wrote about the northern regions, I love this quote. In the Western imagination, the North has long figured as a region profoundly hostile to human habitation. Throughout the history of contact, visitors to the North have commented on the rudeness of its Aboriginal peoples. They're so rude. On their unkempt appearance and ramshackle dwellings. Their primitive arts and uncouth speech. They can't even talk. And into this mix, or into this set of ideas about the world, steps anthropology, which basically the whole founding notion of anthropology was, hey, let's just go see. Let's go study these other people and see what makes them different. And that's the whole basis of it. That is why Trouillot says that anthropology was assigned to the slot of the savage, which is to say that here we have this notion in the West which creates an us, a civilized us, and a primitive or savage other. And we have all these academic disciplines which study the us, history, economics, philosophy, sociology, political science. Almost every discipline has changed a little bit now. People in sociology study other people too. But in its original incarnation, all of these disciplines, including history, just studied the West, just studied the us. And so anthropology got everybody else in the world, everybody else, And what Trouillot is arguing is that structures the whole nature of what anthropology was doing and brought back to the rest of the world, that it was structured by forces larger than its academic position or what it was said to be studying. But the premise of anthropology was to do something that, as Ingold says in the middle of that quote, barring those few who got to know its inhabitants well, that we would actually get to know people and figure out the big idea of anthropology, of course, is, hey, we all have culture, man. We all have culture. We all have language. We all have art. A good day, we all have architecture. And you can see this in terms of the history of anthropological thought, dating to people like Franz Boas in the United States and the students of Boas, such as Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead. Ruth Benedict's 1934 book, Patterns of Culture, which the New York Times says is an enduring classic, so it must be true. Her Patterns of Culture would introduce this idea that everyone had culture to much of the world. And this is 1934. And so it was a tract or a volume which spoke against the racial and environmental determinism that was so prevalent at the time, and spoke for a more culturally relativistic approach, as she probably could be credited with in some ways inventing or at least crystallizing that idea and promoting it for a popular audience. Or we talked about Claude Lévi-Strauss over in France a few years later, who in some ways probably was more famous than any US anthropologist, at least globally. And as Trouillot said, perhaps no one did more to get rid of or adjust the savage slot for, or at least academic and maybe even popular audiences than Claude Lévi-Strauss. Because his argument was that the minds of people in the so-called primitive or savage societies were exactly the same as the minds of those in so-called civilized societies. And that we were all governed, and this is why Ingold gets upset at him, but that we were all governed by this subconscious binary divisions of the mind that was guiding our actions. But what he did was to say that these were the minds of, we were all part of that was operating on all of our subconscious at this mythical level. Or we discussed the work of, say, Clifford Geertz, who updates in 1973 the work of others in anthropology to try and get us to understand the beauty and the interpretation of other cultures, and at least for academic audiences, would introduce things like the Balinese cockfight and others as a way of interpreting or understanding other people's societies. In an ideal history of anthropological thought, we'd read all these books, or at least sections of these books, and we'd build our way from 1885 all the way up to the present. But it's very difficult to do that in the original language of the time. I'm trying to recapitulate as we go along. But it's perhaps more, or at least equally important, to understand what has happened to the anthropological project over time. So the anthropological idea is we all have culture, language, and art. And to a certain degree, that has been successful. It would be difficult to argue that there is less cultural relativism than there was in the past. We truly do have more culturally relative people now, or people who want to be culturally relative. But at the same time, it is also true that in the popular manifestation of anthropology, we are still the guardians of the savage slot, where people come to us because they want the exotic, the weird, the primitive, the out there types. And that remains true today. It's like when we talked about archaeology. Why are people drawn to archaeology? In addition to dinosaurs, they like to dig things up, pyramids, cool things, cool, weird things that are out there, at least in the popular mind. And you can see that in some ways in how a book like Benedict's was published and read by people. So here's Benedict, whose point of the book in some ways is to get beyond racial determinism. But if you just looked at the cover of that book, what does it tell you? If you picked that book up and thought, what is this about? Just looked at that picture. Yes, I'm asking you to judge books by their cover. Always the best idea. Surfaces. Judge things by their surfaces, don't try to go too deep into it. Look, people have pink heads. Don't get too caught up in these colors, but the point is different people have different colored heads, and that seems to be influencing what they're doing. The idea is that people come in red and yellow, black and white. There they are. Yeah, true. Plus, if you look at the upper part, an analysis of our social structure as related to primitive civilization. The whole point was to get out of this mindset, but it's not really in the popular mind. The other thing is that certainly since 2016, for all of you have witnessed this in your life, or for me, from at least 2001, it seems like people, I don't know if I want to say increasingly, but it's very obvious that there's a whole sector of people who are just like, screw that. Anthropology, no, that's not happening in my life. And it's not well, I'll give you an example of someone who has refused the lessons of anthropology, which is our current president who just signed the English only proclamation. And this was interesting to me also on the campaign trail, because as he was telling us how out of control our southern border was, he kept talking about how there were all these languages down. The people who were coming in were speaking all of these languages you've never heard of. I was trying to figure out what the hell is he talking about? We have all heard of Spanish. I know he has heard of Spanish. So that can't be one of the languages we have never heard of. Where are these languages coming from? I was trying to figure out if he was talking about indigenous languages from, say, Guatemala or something who are coming. That's possible. Maybe people haven't heard of the Maya or something. He said that these are languages that you've never heard of. Everybody's heard of Spanish. As I will say in a second, I'm not actually making anything resembling a political argument here. I'm just actually trying to understand what it is that he was talking about when he said languages you've never heard of. I agree that it's performative. Of course it's performative, but it can't be Spanish is my point. What was he talking about? The point of the matter here is that the lessons of anthropology have been rejected or refused not just by the so-called uneducated. These are people who went to the big schools, who went to the top Ivy elite schools. Here's a different example in Trump's recent address to Congress. He was talking about cutting all these USAID programs, and he said that we had cut this program to Lesotho, a country that nobody has ever heard of, which may be true. It's not a country you hear a lot about, but it's a weird thing to say. And so, well, let me acknowledge the biggest deporter of all was Obama. He's the one who has the most deportations on his watch. And when Trump was running in 2016, he explicitly said, I'm going to do what Obama did, but with more energy. I don't actually think he got up to the Obama levels of deportation, but I'm actually not trying to make a political point. I'm just saying when we have people in politics who justify cutting, say, healthcare or assistance to a country because you've never heard of it, it's a weird place to be as an anthropology teacher. It's a strange place to be. I am just thinking about how do you respond to politicians who say, well, we don't need to do this because this is a country that nobody has ever heard of. And it's in fact a beautiful country that you might want to visit. And so anthropologists, I don't think we've figured out how to respond to this. We haven't even figured out how to respond since, say, 2001. And the reason I say we don't know how to respond is because, one, nobody's heard of any anthropologists since 2001. We keep reprinting Benedict's Patterns of Culture. We've reprinted it about 3 or 4 times since 2001 and got the New York Times to put on a blurb that says an enduring classic. And so we keep rechurning out the same everybody has culture message. And when somebody says something like this, you remember when Ingold went to that conference and everybody is talking about the head and he just went, blah! That's what I feel like too. I'm just, blah! Doesn't make any sense. Now, the thing of the matter is that the anthropology answer, which is respect other cultures, you asshole. Not everybody's an asshole, but some people are, and that's what you should do, does still have its own issues. And these are somewhat theoretical or somewhat within anthropology. So one of the issues that this anthropology, the answer of anthropology, which is everybody has culture, has, is it reinforces or it continues a very prominent distinction in the West that places culture and those things that humans do above the natural world. It also imposes our own, or we might say, elite Western definitions of what art is, what architecture is, what language is, onto other peoples. And something that Silas once complained about, anthropologists become, we're the ones who are going in to interpret your culture. Right? We go in, write a bunch of stuff down and tell you, well, we might not even tell you. We tell other anthropologists and publish a book about it and won't even tell you what we think of your culture because we're just going to give it to other people to read. So anthropologists become the superior guardians of, or the true interpreters of the culture out there. I'm not sure if these are the reasons why the anthropological message has failed or has been refused by so many people, but they are things that at least academically we may want to think about or address if we want to keep doing this anthropological thing. Now, there are two people in my life, or the people I talk to the most about this or think about the most, that to address these issues. One of them I've already mentioned, Michel Rolfe Trouillot, and I pondered assigning this to you all as our central book because he is one of the people who talks the most about this need to abandon the idea of culture for different reasons. Unfortunately, Michel Rolfe Trouillot passed away. His last book was in 2003. Couldn't write for a while. And so when you read him today, it's almost impossible to read. It's almost unreadable. I still might try this one more time, but it'll be after you guys are gone, so don't worry, it won't be there. And I almost went back to my original, the book that was falling apart of Ingold, The Perception of the Environment. And I almost went back to that too, because that was Ingold's original challenge to some of these anthropological issues. This book, however, it was again published in 2000. It's beautiful, but it's old. It speaks to some debates that really aren't debates anymore. And so you're reading people and we wouldn't know why we're reading them. And both of these people are in some ways responding to a trend in anthropology and the social sciences and maybe the academy in general, which we might label postmodernism. In any case, I thought about these things because in some ways, my whole teaching life or objective, my life's work as a teacher is to fuse these two people together because Trouillot is great about political economy and race and the Caribbean, but not so good on indigenous peoples and some of the existential environmental issues that Ingold brings to the table. And so trying to figure out how these two work together is part of my life's work, although I also have to always remember the feminism, gender, sexuality issue, which are blind spots for both of them. And so I have to always, it's sometimes a blind spot for me too. So I always have to bring that back into the picture because they don't do good enough on. So in this book, here we are, to go back to the original first slide. What Ingold is trying to do here is to make allowance for imagination without reopening a gap between humanity and nature that he had gone to such great lengths to close. And that's why when she said that the perception of the environment was such a beautiful book, it was in some ways a beautiful book because it was closing these gaps between humanity and nature. That's all he had to do, was bring some things back together that had been separated. So if we look back to what I called the answer of anthropology and some of the things that the issues it had, Ingold's book was to bring together the division of humanity and nature and to get away from imposing Western elite definitions on others and to chide anthropologists and ask them to actually listen to the voices of the people they were talking to and to take them more seriously. And there's something so beautiful about being able to do that. But in our present moment, we don't need to do that anymore. We need to move on from that. And that's where we need to bring in this imagination component without bringing all this ruptures back into it. And so we need to address these anthropological issues, which are still there, the things that are happening out there. But in this class, I'm taking a somewhat more modest approach because doing anything political, even getting into that little discussion that we just had, is liable to get us in trouble. It's actually pretty crazy out there. And so there's this more modest approach that I would say, which we talked about a little bit. Ingold says we need to heal the rupture between the world and our imagination of it. This healing, I contend, must be a first step toward establishing a more open-ended and sustainable way to live. Now, we talked about this, a way to talk about politics without explicitly talking about politics. Nothing in this class is going to get me thrown in jail, hopefully. Except maybe this moment. I'm not getting political. I just said that I thought maybe we could just let the ocean do what the ocean does. Remember that? I never said do anything. He challenged me. He said that he asked me if I was saying we should go down and start digging. I said, no, you just let the ocean do what the ocean does. There may come a time when it is time to dig. How will you know when it is time to start digging? Exactly right. I'm not saying any words about digging. I will never tell you to dig. If I am not here, it might be time to dig. If I'm still here, I'm not saying anything about digging. Actually, the motto, and maybe I don't do this very well, but my motto from this comes from Max Weber's lecture, Science as a Vocation, where he talks about professoring and lecturing, and this was 100 years ago, but it's still as relevant as today. What Weber said is the prophet and the demagogue do not belong on the academic platform. To the prophet and the demagogue, it is said, go your ways out into the streets and speak openly to the world. That is, speak where criticism is possible. Now, it is probably true that Max Weber's audience was not as vocal as my audience is. But the point of the matter is, if I want to be a prophet or a politician, I should be off in the street. I shouldn't be here. If I'm out there digging, I should be digging. I shouldn't be telling you to dig from up here. So true. Weber went on to say, in the lecture room, we stand opposite our audience and it has to remain silent. The old days, you might say. I deem it irresponsible to exploit the circumstance that for the sake of their career, the students have to attend a teacher's course while there is nobody present to oppose him with criticism.
We heckle you all the time.
You heckle me all the time. But I deem it irresponsible to exploit the circumstance for the sake of your career. You have to attend a teacher's course where there's nobody else to oppose me. The task of the teacher is to serve the students with their knowledge and scientific experience and not to imprint upon them their personal political views. That's right. So that is the big picture. There's also these little picture things. So some of you have, I believe, rightly chided Ingold for seemingly having revelations at every moment. Somebody said that he needed to go touch grass. I actually think it's the opposite. I sometimes think that Ingold should go out and be on the internet more, and that he's done too much time touching grass and he should be online more, and that might help him. But then one deserves to be chided for this, that every page turn, every time you turn the page, you're going to have a new beginning and another revelation. He has childlike wonder. So it is perhaps overblown, although a long time ago, agreeing with Ingold in terms of how modern science had separated out life itself appears diminished, and that the educational process that we all go through is diminishing our hopes and dreams. So yes, filled with wonder. By the way, I'll just say that I am one of the most cynical people. I am probably more cynical than any of you. And so for me, I don't know if that's true, but I'd wager it. I'd bet on it. For me to like this stuff is going a long way. And every so often I do think it's bullshit. But Ingold says here that it's not exactly, it's to be enchanted. The enchanted traveler opens their senses to the world as if for the first time. It is true, touching grass for the first time. What did you say? To be enchanted. He's always filled with wonder. And that's what he says. He says never to be awestruck, but it is perpetually to be filled with wonder. So I would say that if Ingold is annoying sometimes, and the way he writes can be very, very obtuse. If we don't always get to the big picture stuff, at least every so often some things in this have filled me with wonder. So I went back and I looked at all the things all the little things, the little revelations that have filled me with wonder. So again, this is big picture stuff, but it's about the historical transformations that we have gone through that have brought us to this point. A couple classes ago, we talked about these assumptions that come to us from ancient Greece, that on land there is order, but in the sea brings in chaos and other people and immigrants and things like that that erode political order. And of course, the Greeks are famous for their monumental building and expressing the state power of monuments and things that are supposed to endure over time. And during this time, people liked the idea of being a peasant, being firmly rooted in the earth, and they were against those wayfarers and nomads and mariners who were always on the sea. Even though the peasants were battling the land, it was felt that that was the way you won. And so when we get to the time of around 1620 and Francis Bacon, you have this idea of the scientific revolution, all of these things are valorizing a certain way of life, being ordered, being in a state, being in an orderly nation, being basically sedentary, and starting to transform the world according to these ideas of scientific experiment. And so these are old foundations that Ingold has discussed of the way we got to be the way we are. But the real way in which the world has been shaped is not necessarily by these ideas, but by the machinery of capitalism and the engineers that have helped us to get to this world. And I found it fascinating to just think about this first wave of transformation, which was again built on these ideas, but instantiated them or realized them. So being able to move across the ocean, and we talked about a time when then islands became central and having a bunch of land became a problem. And so if you could move across the waves, and if these are not absolute year times, but I would say from about 1500 to 1750, we had this first wave transformation of what would bring us into the what we consider the modern world. And then in the second wave, a wave we are still in now, although most of us have given up on the railways, we have railways and highways and pavement and then air travel. And then the islands fade back again. They're not that important. The ocean is not that as important as the being able to occupy land. And that's been from about 750 to the present. We'll then discuss, are we about to go back into water world or that coming crash where this whole way of life fades out and people are doing things, but not in the same way? We don't know. We don't know how that will be, but this is an interesting way to frame the world we're in now. So I've been fascinated by this framing of the world and how the world has transformed. We were talking about Japanese lacquerware and the ways in which this was meant to be appreciated in candlelight. And Ingold said something which I have been really thinking about a lot, that for much of human history, things looked different than they look now. Anytime you needed light, you either got it from the sun or the moon or the stars, or from something that was burning, a candle, something that lit your way. Combustion was essential to light. That when we walked on the ground, where we're walking on paths, the whole notion of reading as being able to trace out a line on a text and often out loud. And so the ways in which our whole lives have been transformed by being able to flick on an electric light, boom, it's there. And also going from almost never seeing yourself, not having even a mirror, and only seeing your face as in other people's faces, to basically looking a lot at ourselves, staring at ourselves more than any time before. I showed you that on Zoom. And it is just, as Ingold asked, is it a world we really want? A world in which we spend a lot of our time looking at screens and looking at ourselves. I found that curious in this class because I find myself reading myself. It's so weird. It's like there's three of me. It's very subversive, though. I do enjoy it. I think you're doing the right thing. So Ingold has told us that the whole notion of screen has changed. It used to be that when we talked about a screen, it was a textile or a tent screen. And so when I said he was building screens and repairing screens, I would thought he's working on computers. But you're not. What were you doing? Did it look like this? The archaeological screen. How long have they been talking about screens like this in archaeology? Any guesses? I don't know. A while. It's older. It must be older than our screens. There, the old form of screens. We need to get back to some of these practices without romanticizing them. All right? We need to recapture what was lost without being overly romantic. So in terms of the humans and the nature division, the animals have much to teach us so long as we allow them into our presence as the beings they are. So I talked about this dominance of humans over nature, and Ingold's been perhaps one of the best anthropologists at trying to understand how to ununderstand that. And this was just the animals have much to teach us, but let them be the beings they are. And so the question for me is, how do we recapture some of that those older notions of screens and light and sound and perception without falling into this romantic going back. I don't want to give up my PowerPoint. I don't want to give up my screens. Don't want to, I don't want to go back. I want to go forward. We also looked at experience and reality and trying to understand how something like a dragon could be a palpable incarnation of what it meant to know fear. No fear. Or how dreams could be the evidence for reality, not a separation from it. So again, trying to reconnect our imagination and our reality and our experience. Or this chapter I really liked a lot about the conical lodge, because in some ways what Ingold was arguing here is that we're trying to go from this idea of imposing our own definitions of what is architecture onto other societies to reconceptualizing what it means to build things in all. Ingold writes, I want to propose an alternative view of building, not as the projection of form onto matter, but as the binding together of materials in movement. So the lodge is stitched into the fabric of the earth. We also saw how beauty can be appreciated. We can think about things aesthetically as processes, a going along together. Sometimes the fact that we often see art as painting gets in the way. You said that you have a bunch of crappy paintings around, unfinished paintings. I just found that a strange way to think about it. You wouldn't say that if you were practicing guitar, you wouldn't say, I have a bunch of unfinished guitar songs sitting around, or I started it, but I couldn't finish it. But painting is this weird thing where we think we have to have a product at the end. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's what you were saying. Yeah, so it was good. It was good to do all those things. That's why I think you're into gesture drawing. All right, just do it quick, and it's done. It's the process. That is nice. Yeah. So sometimes painters get us. Am I insulting any painters? Okay. Sculptors. And then there's the idea of wayfaring, which I've been encouraging you to do at every moment, to keep on going, not just going between points, but to just be. It sounds like some of you did great over spring break at this. And I like this, even though you laughed at me for it.
Oh, you were right. I was wrong to laugh.
You were wrong to laugh. Those things are about to fall back into the water, and then he's going to have to swim along and keep on going. So sometimes at the moment of revelation, it all falls apart. Or the idea of immersion, of not just building a bridge between two things that are stupid. Sometimes you do need a bridge to get across, but to maybe sometimes jump into the water and swim down. That's where we want to be. Or on a hang glider, gliding through the air as long as we don't die, immersed in the painting itself. I have to say this messed me up one time because I went to an art gallery. It was Van Gogh's nature drawings, and I'd been reading a lot of Ingold, and so I was trying to immerse myself in the paintings. So I was in the drawings, and so I got really close, and then I got closer, and then this guy came and step back 12 inches from the drawings. So be careful about this in an art gallery. You might get in trouble if you peer too closely.
Is that the painting he was talking about? The wind?
Yeah. Thermal, yeah. Was my life and death for nothing? Ingold says that the ghost of Lanyon comes out. Yeah. Why are you here? Were my life and death for nothing?
Oh, I did read the book.
Yeah, but did you read it like that? Can you not feel for yourself the air, the violence, the sheer force of the elements? This is what it means to be alive. This is what I died for. I cannot explain it. I cannot describe it, but this is it. It might be better in person, by the way. This is a projection. So we did our sensory tune-up in part one. We did part two, which I have interpreted as analyzing and interpreting. And now we are on to part three, remaking the world, I'm going to say. It is about what we are making and doing in the world. So Ingold begins this introduction, his part four, but I'm calling it part three, by asking us to think about, as we are doing something or observing other people's do something, what are you doing? If you were to ask me, what are you doing compared to what are you making? You are all drawn to the best quotes. Much of the hype that currently surrounds making feeds on the commercial imperative to innovate. From fab labs to sand pits, places of making are turned into havens for self-styled creatives to engage in tournaments of intellectual juggling, while the productive engagement with materials that actually gives birth to things is reduced to little more than the three-dimensional equivalent of a printout. Yeah, I thought that you thought, maybe you thought, I thought all these places you go to and they put in a 3D printer and they call it a maker space.
That's also stupid.
That's what he's talking about, where you just go in and all of a sudden you're supposed to juggle all these ideas and come out with something, print it out, and you're called a maker. It's so.
You are a maker. That's part of your identity.
Yeah. I feel better if like they filled them up with clay or something. Ingold is talking about a particularly capitalist incarnation of these spaces where you go in and you design and then you print it out. But although I can't help thinking, have you seen some of these 3D printouts where they do it and it just is crap? So there actually has to be something else involved in the pure idea to the printout, because to actually do that correctly is also an artisan skill. But anyway, though I agree with that too. I don't think a maker space has to be crappy. It's just it often turns into that because we prioritize these weird technological solutions to just playing with Legos. Oh, I'll go on one quick rant. You know how in the old days we used to just get Legos and just got a box of fucking Legos and you played with them, and now you have to get a set and you have to make a car, and then you never undo it. Those are the negatives. Let's go to the positive. So what Ingold wants to prioritize is the making over the doing. Oh, wow. Wait, it sounds like it's getting back into the earth shifting chapter too. Kind of. But you are working with it.
Always.
You're constantly.
The ice comes, puddles, basically.
You're constantly adjusting and moving things. Two of you were into this quote about how thinking is not just inside the head, but in the world. What's that mean to you? We often have this idea that thinking is something we cognitively do. And what Ingold is trying to have us imagine is that it's something that we do actually in the world. The whole section is going to be about material thinking, or thinking through materials and those things. To the point, well, actually, what if instead of putting thought at the beginning and the made object at the end with the doing sandwiched in between, we were to situate both thinking and making within the life of doing? What if